The morning Edwin Slater nailed the last plank onto his front porch, he stood back, looked at the perfectly level wood, and felt nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. That was the whole of Edwin Slater, contained in that single moment, a man who measured twice, cut once, and never wasted a nail or a word or a feeling on something that did not serve a clear and necessary purpose. He was 31 years old in the autumn of 1878, living on 240 acres of grassland outside the town of Harlow Creek, Kansas, and he had built every inch of what surrounded him with his own two hands and a philosophy as straight and unadorned as the timber frame of his house. The house itself was the color of dried clay. The curtains, what few there were undyed muslin. The furniture was solid, functional, and exactly where it needed to be. There were no paintings on the walls, no rugs on the floors beyond the single braided one beside his bed that kept his feet from the cold boards in winter. Nothing in Edwin Slater's home existed without earning its place. He had come to Kansas from Missouri 6 years prior, after his father passed and left him three things: a mule named Corbin, a dog-eared Bible he never opened, and an unshakable belief that sentiment was the enemy of survival. He had worked for a cattle outfit for 2 years before saving enough to buy the land. He had broken the soil himself, planted wheat, added a small herd of cattle, and built a life with the same efficiency he applied to everything. The neighboring ranchers respected him. The men in town found him steady and reliable, though not much for conversation. The women, those who had tried, eventually stopped trying. Edwin Slater was not cold exactly. He simply had no understanding of warmth as anything other than a practical matter of firewood. He was thinking about none of this on the October morning when the stagecoach from Abilene rolled into Harlow Creek carrying Theodora Leland. He had gone into town for fence wire and flour. He had a list. He intended to complete the list in the correct order, beginning at the feed store and ending at the post office. And he had allowed himself exactly 2 hours for the errand before he needed to be back to check on the eastern fence line, which had been showing worrying signs of weakness near the creek bend. He was tying his horse to the hitching post outside the feed store when the coach pulled in across the street, and the world, as he had known it, began its slow and irreversible tilt. She came out of the coach like something that did not belong to the landscape. Not because she was dressed finely, because she wasn't. Her traveling dress was practical enough, a deep burgundy wool that had seen some miles. But because she moved through the dust and the noise of Harlow Creek's main street with her chin up and her eyes wide, and her head turning to take in every storefront and water trough and crooked sign, as though she were memorizing a painting. She had a trunk that the driver was wrestling off the top of the coach, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and in her right hand she carried a wooden box with a latched lid, which she held with the kind of care people reserve for things that are either valuable or irreplaceable. Edwin noticed all of this in the way a man notices weather. Cataloged it, filed it, went inside for his fence wire. Theodora Leland was 26 years old, born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she had come to Harlow Creek under circumstances that were practical enough on paper but felt, to her, like the first act of something she could not yet name. Her father had died in the spring, leaving debts she could not pay on a schoolteacher's wages, and her only remaining family, an aunt named Celeste, lived in Harlow Creek where she'd been for 15 years, married to the town's blacksmith. Theodora had packed what she could carry, which included her clothes, her aunt's letters, $40 she'd saved over 3 years, and the wooden box, and she had come west because there was nowhere else to go and because, underneath the practicality of it, something in her had wanted to go west for as long as she could remember. She stood in the street outside the stage office and looked up at the pale Kansas sky and breathed in air that smelled of horse and dry grass and wood smoke, and she thought, yes. Whatever happens next, yes. Her Aunt Celeste found her within minutes, a small round woman with flour on her apron and tears on her cheeks, who pulled Theodora into a hug that lasted long enough to feel like an answer. The blacksmith, a broad, quiet man named Harold, carried the trunk without being asked and said "Welcome to Kansas," which were the most words Theodora would hear him say in a single sentence for quite some time. Edwin Slater completed his list in the correct order. He got his fence wire. He got his flour. He stopped at the post office and collected 3 items: a seed catalog, a tax notice, and a letter from the land office in Dodge City that turned out to contain a surveying error he would need to address before winter. He rode home in the thin October sun and spent the afternoon on the eastern fence line, and did not think about the woman in the burgundy dress again. Not until that evening, anyway. He was eating supper alone: beans and salt pork, which he cooked in exactly the amounts he needed and left no waste, when he found himself looking up at the empty wall above the fireplace. He had looked at that wall 5,000 times. He had never found it lacking. But for one strange moment in the October dark, the blankness of it registered on him differently, like a silence that had changed its quality without making any sound. He looked away. He ate his beans. He banked the fire and went to bed. Theodora's first weeks in Harlow Creek were the kind that build a life in layers. She helped her aunt with the house and the cooking, and she began quietly making herself useful wherever she could find a place to be useful. She had been a school teacher, and the town of Harlow Creek had a school that was taught by a man named Beaumont Ferris, who was 70 years old and had been trying to retire for 3 of them. Within a fortnight of Theodora's arrival, she had spoken with the school board, which consisted of 3 ranchers and the Reverend, and had secured a position as Ferris's assistant, with the understanding that she would take over full instruction when he finally permitted himself to stop. She was good at the work. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they love, which is differently from being good at things they are merely skilled in. She learned the children's names quickly, remembered which ones struggled and which ones needed more room to run before they could sit still, and within a month the schoolroom, which had been a dim and cheerless space of peeling whitewash and broken shutters, had been transformed by small and accumulating interventions. New curtains, which Theodora and her aunt sewed from a bolt of yellow cotton she found at the dry goods store. A painted border along the top of the chalkboard, not elaborate, just a simple repeating pattern of leaves and vines that she did in the evenings with a brush, and the small set of paints she kept in the wooden box. A jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. The children sat straighter. Theodora was not entirely sure there was a causal connection, but she suspected one. It was the paints that would eventually bring her to Edwin Slater's door, though it would take some time and several intermediate steps to get there. The first time they actually spoke was at the Harlow Creek General Store in mid-November. Theodora was examining a bolt of cloth at the back of the store when she knocked a tin of nails off the shelf beside her, and they scattered across the floorboards in every direction. She was on her knees gathering them when a pair of boots appeared in her field of vision, worn and well-made and covered in a thin layer of Kansas dust, and a hand came down to help. "These are mine," said Edwin Slater, which was not the most poetic opening line in the history of the territory, but was at least accurate. Theodora looked up. She saw a man with a lean face and dark eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who believed in economy, and the kind of hands that belonged to a man who worked with them constantly. He was not handsome the way that men in novels were handsome. He was handsome the way good tools were handsome, everything exactly where it ought to be, nothing wasted. "I am sorry," Theodora said. "I knocked them when I turned." "It's fine," Edwin said, and he scooped up the remaining nails with an efficiency that suggested he had counted them already. He straightened up. He had not meant to keep looking at her, but she was still on the floor, sitting back on her heels, and there was a streak of paint on the inside of her left wrist, a thin streak of deep blue that she hadn't scrubbed out completely, and for some reason that detail lodged in him like a splinter. "You're the new school teacher," he said. It was not a question. Harlow Creek had 900 people and everyone knew things about everyone within days. Teaching assistant for now, Theodora said, rising to her feet. Theodora Leland. Edwin Slater, he said. They shook hands, which was unusual enough. Most men of the territory did not shake hands with women as a matter of course, but Theodora had extended hers, and Edwin responded to the gesture without overthinking it. Her grip was firm and brief. The blue paint was on her left wrist, and he caught a clearer look at it now. It was the color of a Kansas sky in August, deep and unrelenting. "You paint," he said. Theodora blinked, then looked down at her wrist. "Oh," she said. "Yes." The schoolroom needed something. Edwin nodded once. He took his tin of nails to the counter. Theodora watched him go and felt the strange, small recognition of meeting someone who was going to matter, though she could not have said why. He paid for his nails and left without looking back. Theodora bought her cloth and walked home in the gray November wind, and told her aunt about nothing in particular. And her aunt, who had known Celeste Leland for 50 years and knew her niece nearly as well, watched the way Theodora's hands were a little more animated than usual and said nothing, and smiled into the pot she was stirring. December arrived, and with it the first hard frost, and Harlow Creek settled into the particular rhythm of a plains town in winter. The cattle ranchers were busy with their stock. The farmers had nothing left to do but mend and wait. The school continued, and Theodora continued in it, and on Saturdays she helped with the church, and on Sunday afternoons she painted. She had been painting since she was 12 years old. Her mother had given her the box, the wooden box she'd carried from Cincinnati, along with its contents, a set of 8 oil paints in small lead tubes, 3 brushes, 2 small canvases, and a mixing board of stained walnut. Her mother was dead now, 7 years gone from a fever, and the box was the only material object in Theodora's possession that she would not have traded for anything, not money, not safety, not warmth. She painted carefully, slowly, making the canvases last, painting over old work when she had to. She painted the Kansas sky over and over because it was different every day. She painted the dry golden grass of the plains in winter, the way it bent in the wind. She painted Harlow Creek's main street from memory, capturing things that the inhabitants of the street no longer saw because they had been looking at them too long. It was through her painting that the next chapter of the story between herself and Edwin Slater began. She was painting on a Saturday afternoon in late December, set up on the edge of the road that ran north of town, capturing the way the winter light fell on the line of cottonwood trees along the creek. When Edwin Slater rode past on his return from somewhere, saw her, and pulled up his horse without fully deciding to. Theodora was too absorbed to notice him immediately. She was working with a small brush and the burnt sienna tube, laying in the shadows between the tree roots, and her tongue was between her teeth in the way people hold it when they are concentrating very hard on their hands. Edwin watched her for a moment that stretched too long for a man who prided himself on efficient use of time. The canvas was small, propped on a wooden box, and even from a distance he could see the quality of the image. The trees looked like the actual trees. The light on them looked like the actual light. He had not thought much about painting as a category of human endeavor before. It had always seemed to him a luxury item, something that existed in parlors and galleries in cities where people had time and money for such things. But looking at Theodora Leland paint the cottonwoods in the late December afternoon, he understood something new about it that he could not have articulated but could feel in the same region of his chest, where he sometimes felt the weather coming. "That's the Calvert tree line," he said. Theodora started. She turned and saw him on his horse and pressed a hand to her sternum. "You frightened me," she said. "I'm sorry," he said, and he sounded like he meant it, which surprised her. "Yes, it is," she said, recovering herself. "You can see the bend in the creek from here. That lower branch catches the light at this time of day in a way I haven't been able to." She stopped. She smiled. "You probably don't care about any of that." "I didn't say that," Edwin said. He dismounted. He tied his horse to a tree limb and walked closer and stood where he could see the canvas properly, and he looked at it for a long time. Long enough that Theodora, who was accustomed to people glancing at her paintings politely and then looking away, began to be curious. "It looks like the trees," he said finally. "But more than just that." Theodora waited. "It looks like the feeling of the trees," he said, and he looked surprised at himself for saying it. Theodora turned back to the canvas and added 3 strokes of paint to the lowest branch while she thought about what to say to that. "That is exactly what I am trying to do," she said at last. "I am never sure if I'm getting it right." "You are," Edwin said simply. He stood there for a few more minutes in the way of a man who has somewhere to be but is finding reasons to stay where he is, and then he said, "Good afternoon, Miss Leland," and untied his horse and rode on. Theodora watched him go and then turned back to her painting and smiled at the canvas the way a woman smiles when she does not want the sky to see. It was her Aunt Celeste who eventually created the occasion for something more sustained between them. Celeste, who knew every piece of gossip in Harlow Creek and filtered it through a practical intelligence that was sharper than her cheerful exterior suggested, mentioned one evening in January that Edwin Slater's ranch hand had quit to go to Colorado for the silver, and that Slater was managing the whole operation alone through what was shaping up to be a hard winter. "He's a proud man," Celeste said, rolling biscuit dough with her usual vigor. "Won't ask for help, but Harold says the eastern pasture fence is coming down and he won't have enough hands to keep the cattle from drifting before spring." "Why are you telling me this?" Theodora asked. Celeste looked up with the expression of a woman who is telling you exactly what she appears to be telling you. "No reason at all," she said. "I just mentioned it." But the following week, when the Ladies' Aid Society organized a work drive to help 3 families in the area whose men were laid up with winter illness, Theodora volunteered to coordinate the effort and put Edwin Slater's name on the list, on the grounds that a single man managing a large property alone in winter qualified as need. The committee agreed, and a Saturday was designated. Edwin came to the door of his house on that January Saturday and found Theodora Leland on his porch with her aunt and 2 other women and Harold Vance the blacksmith and 2 of Harold's friends, and a wagon full of lumber, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at all of them with an expression that was not quite any single emotion. "The Ladies' Aid," Theodora said. She smiled. "We heard your eastern fence line needs attention." "I don't need," he began. "Edwin," Harold said, "let the people help." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be interesting. Then Edwin Slater stepped back from the door and said, "The fence is in the east pasture," and that was that. They worked through the morning. Edwin worked alongside Harold and the other men on the fence, and Theodora and the women reorganized his larder, which was functional but grim, and made a meal for the work crew. Theodora moved through his house with the brisk efficiency of a woman performing a defined task, but she was also quietly looking at everything. The house was clean. That was the first thing. Remarkably clean for a single man. Swept floors, no dishes unwashed, no disorder. But it was a house that had been stripped of everything non-essential, and nothing had grown back. The walls were bare. The windows had no treatment that wasn't purely functional. There was no color anywhere that hadn't arrived as part of the raw material, the brown of the wood, the gray of the stone fireplace, the black of the iron stove. It was like living inside a useful sentence with all the adjectives removed. Theodora found herself standing in the front room with a dishcloth in her hands, looking at the large wall above the fireplace and feeling the blankness of it like a held breath. She did not say anything. She finished the work she had come to do. The meal was served and eaten at the long kitchen table, 8 people around it, and it was the most people Edwin Slater had had in his house at one time in 6 years. He sat at the head of the table and passed bread and accepted thanks for the meal, which were actually directed at the women who'd made it, and he was quieter than the others but present in a way that was different from his usual self-contained distance. He refilled cups without being asked. When Theodora said something that made the table laugh, He looked at her with an attention that he quickly redirected to the window. After the meal, when the others were seeing to the wagon and Harold was walking the fence with Edwin to review what had been done, Theodora washed the dishes alone in the kitchen. Through the window above the sink she could see the pale January light on the pasture and the figures of the two men moving along the fence line. She watched Edwin stop and bend to examine a post and felt, with complete and uncomplicated clarity, that she wanted to know him. Not in the polite way of a small community where everyone knew everyone, in the way that required something of both people, in the way that mattered. She dried the last dish, set it in its place, and walked back through the front room. She stopped again at the fireplace wall. Then she took her coat from the hook by the door and walked out to join the others. February in Kansas was a test of character that the territory applied impartially to everyone within it. The cold came down from the north and settled in like a long-term tenant, and the days were short and gray, and the wind had a personal quality to it, as though it had specific grievances. Schools continued because Theodora kept them going, lighting the stove an hour before the children arrived and staying late to make sure the room was warm. She read to the older students from whatever books she could find or borrow and wrote letters to Cincinnati and St. Louis to request donations of materials. Edwin Slater came into town twice in February. Both times he saw Theodora, and both times they spoke for longer than either of them had planned to. The first occasion was at the general store again, and they ended up in the same conversation about the approaching territorial elections, which was not a topic either of them had expected to share opinions on, and yet they did. Theodora had views about the state of the local cattle ordinances that were informed and specific and slightly surprising, coming from a schoolteacher from Ohio, and Edwin found himself listening to them with more interest than he had applied to that subject in some time. The second occasion was a Sunday afternoon when he came out of the post office and found her sitting on the wooden bench outside, waiting for her aunt, and he sat beside her because there was nowhere else to sit that wasn't in the direct line of the wind, and they talked about the winter and the cattle and then, gradually, about other things. Her work at the school, his family in Missouri, her childhood in Cincinnati, the way the sky looked different every day over the Kansas plains. Edwin talked more than he had expected to. He said things he had not said to anyone in years, and did not entirely understand why he was saying them now, except that Theodora Leland listened the way very few people did, without preparing her response while you were still speaking, without steering the conversation toward herself, with a quality of focused attention that felt, to a man who spent most of his time alone, like being given something he had not known he was missing. When her aunt appeared and they rose to leave, Theodora paused and said, "You ought to come to the schoolhouse one evening. I've done something with the room and I'd value your opinion." He said he would. He meant to say it politely and then find reasons not to go, but he went. He came on a Tuesday evening when the children were gone and the school was lit by lamplight and Theodora was cleaning the chalkboard. She turned when she heard the door and dusted the chalk from her hands and said, "Come in and see." He came in and saw. She had repainted the border above the chalkboard. That was the small thing. The larger thing was a canvas mounted on the wall beside the door, a painting of the Kansas sky in summer, that deep, unrelenting blue she'd been chasing since October, with the cottonwood trees along the creek rendered in the foreground in their summer fullness. And the light in it was so exactly the light that Edwin had grown up under, not Kansas light specifically, but the light of wide, open country and long days and a world that was still becoming what it would be. That he stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. "You painted that," he said. "Over the summer and fall," Theodora said. "I finished it in December. I thought the children should have it." Edwin looked at it until he felt he had looked at it long enough and then looked away, because to keep looking would have required explaining something about himself that he was not ready to explain. He looked at the yellow curtains and the dried flowers and the border of leaves and vines along the chalkboard and the general quality of the room, which was unmistakably the quality of a place where someone had decided that beauty was not wasteful, and he felt the ground shift under him slightly in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. "It's good work," he said. Theodora smiled. "I've been thinking," she said, then stopped. "About what?" Edwin asked. She looked at him with an expression that was considering something. "About your house," she said, "the wall above your fireplace." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "It's empty," Theodora said. "I noticed when we were there in January." "I know it's empty," Edwin said. "I would like to paint something for it," Theodora said, "if you would allow it." The silence that followed was the kind that contains a decision being made. Edwin looked at her and she looked back at him, and the lamplight in the schoolroom was warm and the night outside was cold, and somewhere in the town, a dog was barking at a sound in the dark. "I'll think about it," Edwin said. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he came to the school on Friday afternoon as the children were leaving and caught Theodora at the door and said, "Yes, if you want to." She painted it in March. She came to his house 3 separate times to work on the canvas, which she prepared at her aunt's house and then brought out to the ranch to complete and hang. Edwin worked his land during those visits, mostly keeping a distance that was respectful without being pointed. But on the second visit, he came in for water mid-morning and found her on the step stool she'd brought from her aunt's house, applying the first full layer of color to what would eventually become a painting of the plains at sunset. And he poured his water and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her work for 10 minutes without her noticing. And in those 10 minutes something happened in him that had no practical category and no useful purpose, and that he could not have dismantled even if he had tried. She was completely absorbed. Her whole body was in the work, not just her hands. She leaned and reached and stepped back and tilted her head and bit her lip and made the small, involuntary sounds of someone entirely at home in what they are doing. And the colors she was laying down were extraordinary. The deep amber and rose of the sunset sky, the long purple shadows on the grass, the thin, bright line of the horizon where the earth met the light. His plain, clay-colored wall was becoming something that had no right to be so beautiful, and he could feel, in some inarticulate but certain way, that once it was there, he would never be the same house without it. He put down his cup and went back outside and worked until his hands ached, and did not let himself think about what that meant. On the third visit, she finished it. She called him in from the field to see, and he came in with dirt on his hands and stood in front of the fireplace and looked at it. It was the plains. It was exactly the plains he had been looking at for 6 years, and had never allowed himself to find beautiful because finding it beautiful served no purpose. And it was something more than that. In the foreground, half hidden in the grass, were the small, precise details of a working ranch. A fence post, a water bucket, a coil of rope, and these ordinary things were rendered with the same care and attention as the flaming sky above them, as though the painting was insisting that the practical and the beautiful were not separate things, but the same thing seen from different angles. Edwin Slater stood in front of that painting for a full minute and did not say a word, and Theodora stood beside him and did not speak either, and the fire in the hearth below made the colors in the canvas move slightly in the warm light, and when Edwin finally spoke his voice was not quite what it usually was. "Thank you," he said. "Does it suit the house?" Theodora asked. Her voice was careful. She was watching his face. "It suits the house," Edwin said. He turned to look at her then, and the look was direct and unguarded in a way that Theodora had not seen from him before. All the careful practicality momentarily set aside, and she held his gaze and felt the full weight of it. Then he looked away and said he'd make coffee, and she said yes please, and they drank coffee at the kitchen table for an hour and talked about things that were not the painting. And when she left, he stood on the porch and watched the wagon until it turned off his property, and then went back inside and stood in front of the fireplace for a long time. He did not take it down. Not that night, not in the days that followed, not ever. April came to Kansas with a violence of green that caught Theodora unprepared every morning. She had never seen grass come in so fast or so completely. It was as though the plains were making a point. She was fully in charge of the school now, Beaumont Ferris having finally and gratefully retired with a small party thrown in his honor. And she was also beginning to put down the roots of a genuine life in Harlow Creek. A regular seat at the Ladies' Aid meetings, a small group of friends, a familiarity with the rhythms of the town that had graduated from visitor to resident. Edwin Slater had begun coming to Sunday services more regularly than he had previously, which was noticed by his neighbors without comment. He sat in the third pew on the left side, and Theodora sat 5 rows behind him on the right side, and they did not sit together, but they invariably ended up in conversation after the service on the church steps, and the conversations invariably lasted longer than either of them could account for. In early April, he came to the school again, ostensibly to donate lumber for a repair to the schoolhouse steps that Theodora had written up for the town council, and which the town council had been slow to address. He came with the lumber and 2 hours of time and fixed the steps himself while Theodora taught her morning class, and when she came out at noon with 2 cups of coffee, he was on his knees fitting the last board and she handed him a cup and said, "Thank you, Edwin." And it was the first time she had used his given name, and he heard it and looked up and said, "You're welcome, Theodora," and it was also the first time he had used hers. And both of them knew the moment was a marker of something, though neither of them named it. He asked her to dinner. It was not elegantly done. They were standing in the schoolyard in the April sun, and he was gathering up his tools, and she was leaning against the wall with her hands wrapped around her cup, and he said, without preamble, "There's a social at the Barker farm on Saturday. Would you come with me?" Theodora looked at him over the rim of her cup. "As your companion?" she asked. "Yes," Edwin said. "I would like that," Theodora said. He nodded once. He put his tools in his wagon. He drove off. Theodora went back into the school and sat at her desk for a moment, and pressed both hands flat on the wood and breathed evenly, because the occasion seemed to call for it. The Barker Social was a spring gathering that the Barker family hosted every year on their large farm outside of town, which had been a tradition in Harlow Creek since before Edwin arrived. There was food and dancing, a fiddle player and a guitar, long tables under the sky, and most of the town present in their Saturday clothes. Edwin arrived to collect Theodora from her aunt's house at 5 in the afternoon, wearing a white shirt she had not seen before and his better hat, and he handed her up into the wagon without fumbling, and they drove out to the Barker farm in the golden spring evening, and Edwin, who was not a talkative man on the best of days, managed to maintain a conversation for the entire 20-minute drive that was actually pleasant and easy, which surprised both of them. Theodora wore the burgundy dress, the one she'd arrived in, with a cream lace collar that her aunt had pressed for her that morning, and her dark hair pinned up in the simple way she wore it for occasions. Edwin glanced at her when she came out of her aunt's house and looked immediately back at the road, which Celeste, standing in the doorway, watched with a satisfaction that she kept entirely to herself. They ate at the long tables with neighbors and ranchers and their families, and Edwin was sociable in his contained way, and Theodora was warm and easy and made people laugh, and the couple they made together was the topic of several quiet conversations around the edges of the gathering. When the fiddles started up after supper and people began moving onto the cleared ground that served as the dance floor, Theodora turned to Edwin and asked if he danced. He said he did not. She said she would teach him. He said he did not think the evening was the appropriate time. She said there was never an appropriate time, you simply started. He looked at her with an expression that was caught between his natural resistance to the unplanned and something that looked very much like the desire to say yes to this particular unplanned thing, and then he stood up and said, "One dance." One dance became 3. He was not a natural dancer and made no pretense of being one, but he was careful and attentive and followed her lead without ego. And by the third dance, he had stopped apologizing for his feet and was instead watching her face in the lamplight with a concentration that had nothing to do with the steps and everything to do with the fact that Theodora Leland was looking back at him with an expression of uncomplicated happiness that he had never seen directed at himself before, and that lodged in his chest like something very warm. They drove home under a sky that was thick with stars. The Kansas night was soft and cool, and the horses went at their own pace, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, which was not an uncomfortable silence but the kind that means something has shifted and you are both finding your footing on the new ground. "I had a good time," Edwin said finally. "So did I," Theodora said. Another silence. "I would like to do it again," Edwin said. He said it carefully, measuring the words the way he measured lumber, cutting them to the exact length needed. "A social?" Theodora asked. "No," Edwin said. "I would like to spend more time with you in whatever way suits you." Theodora looked at the stars above the Kansas plain and felt the rightness of the moment settle around her like good weather. "That suits me very well, Edwin," she said. He walked her to her aunt's door that evening and stood on the step and said good night, and she said good night and nothing else happened. Because Edwin Slater was a man who moved at the speed he moved at, and Theodora, who understood this about him already in the way that certain people understand certain other people quite quickly, did not push. She went inside and her aunt was still awake by the fire and looked up with a question that she did not ask aloud, and Theodora sat down across from her and smiled and said nothing, and Celeste said well, and Theodora said yes, and they left it at that. May, and then June. The spring became summer, and the Kansas plains erupted into the full blaze of the season Edwin had seen captured on his wall, and he and Theodora met every week without the need for formal invitations, a habit having grown up between them as naturally as the June grass. They walked the road between the school and town on evenings when the light lasted long enough. He came with her on Saturdays when she painted, not always, but often enough that she had grown used to his presence beside her, the quiet company of a man who watched with genuine attention and never told her what he thought she ought to be painting. She had begun to understand him in layers. The outermost layer was the practical man, the rancher, the careful and efficient manager of land and resources. Beneath that was a man of considerable intelligence, who had read more than his surroundings suggested and thought carefully about things he never discussed. Beneath that was something she was only beginning to see clearly, a man who had felt things deeply all his life and had simply never found the right container for them, and who was now, slowly and with some internal resistance he never quite managed to hide, finding that she might be that container. She was not without her own complications. She had lived most of her adult life in motion, responding to circumstances rather than choosing them, her mother's death, her father's debts, the move west. She was determined and capable and cheerful in the way of people who have learned that being otherwise helps no one. But underneath the cheerfulness was a woman who had been carrying a great deal alone for a long time and who found in Edwin's steadiness something she had not known she was looking for. He was not exciting in the way of stories. He was reliable in the way of deep water, always where you needed it, always the same depth. She loved him before she knew she did. That was how it worked with her. The thing that made it clear to her was the evening in July when one of her students, a boy named Caleb Marsh, 9 years old and the youngest of a large family with very little to spare, showed up at the school with a broken wrist from a fall and no adult available to take him to the doctor, his mother being 8 months pregnant and his father 4 miles out on the range. Theodora sent word and got the boy settled, and then, because the doctor was busy with another emergency, sat with Caleb for an hour holding his good hand and reading to him from the storybook she kept in her desk. Edwin happened to come into town that afternoon for supplies and heard about the situation from the man at the feed store, and arrived at the schoolhouse without explanation and took Caleb on his knee and told him that a broken wrist healed clean if you let it, and that he himself had broken his left arm at age 11 and hadn't cried once, which was almost certainly untrue, but which Caleb received with the deep gratitude of a boy who needs to hear that things can be survived. When the doctor came and set the wrist and Caleb's father finally arrived, flushed and apologetic, Edwin had been there for 2 hours. Had brought candy from the general store, a small bag of peppermints which he put on the desk without comment. He held the door for the doctor. He said goodbye to Caleb and shook the father's hand and left without making anything of what he had done. Theodora walked him to his horse. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know," Edwin said. He was tightening the cinch on his saddle, his back partly to her. "He was frightened," Theodora said. "You helped him not be frightened." Edwin said nothing. He checked the saddle a second time. "Edwin," Theodora said. He turned and she was close, closer than she had planned, and the late afternoon light was the amber and rose of the painting on his wall, and she looked up at him and said, "You are a good man." And the way she said it was not praise in the general sense but something more specific, more personal, the kind of statement you make to someone when you have seen enough of them to be certain. Edwin Slater looked at Theodora Leland in the July light and felt the full, undefended weight of the regard she was looking at him with, and everything in him that had been moving carefully toward her for 8 months completed its journey in that moment. He kissed her. He leaned down and kissed her once briefly, with a restraint that was almost painful to maintain given how long every part of him had been waiting to do exactly this, and then he stood back and looked at her to see what he had done. Theodora looked at him steadily. "It took you long enough," she said. Something changed in Edwin Slater's face. It was not dramatic, but it was the expression of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying for a very long time, and who is looking at the place where he said it with wonder and relief. He smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the whole of his face, slow and warm and entirely real. "I was being careful," he said. "You have been careful for 31 years, Theodora said. "I think you can afford to be a little less careful now." He kissed her again, which served as his answer. There was a period after that of the kind that exists between two people who have arrived at something real and are now learning to be inside it together. They were not careless or hasty. Edwin was constitutionally incapable of carelessness, and Theodora, for all her warmth, had a natural carefulness of her own, the kind born of having lost enough to know the value of what you hold. But they were also, undeniably, happy, and in the context of Harlow Creek in the summer of 1879, that happiness was visible to everyone within range without either of them making any announcement. Her Aunt Celeste wept with contentment when Theodora told her, which she hadn't been going to do, except that Celeste had put hot apple pie in front of her and looked at her with such knowing patience that it all came out. Harold, told by Celeste over dinner, nodded once and said good for Edwin, which was generous of him. August burned through the plains, and Theodora and Edwin spent it in the rhythm they had built. His ranch and her school, his evenings and her weekends, the long summer light that gave them time to walk and talk and simply be together in the ways that accumulate into a shared life. He began to show her things about the ranch that he had never shown anyone, not because they were secret, but because they had never before had anyone to show. The particular fence post where he'd found a hawk's nest the previous spring. The corner of the east pasture where the soil was different, darker and richer, and where, come spring, he was thinking of putting in a kitchen garden. The exact spot on the rise behind the barn where you could see, on a clear day, the full sweep of his land in all directions, and it was beautiful in the way that things you have built are beautiful, with the additional beauty of what it cost. Theodora stood on that rise one Sunday afternoon in August and looked at his land and said, "You are proud of this?" "Yes," Edwin said. He was standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "You should be," she said. He looked at her. "Would you want to be here?" he asked. The question was direct and a little abrupt in the way of a man who has been building towards something and has finally decided to say it plainly instead of building any further. Theodora looked at him with full attention. "Are you asking me what I think you are asking me?" "I am asking you to marry me," Edwin said. "If you want to. If this is where you want to be." "This is where I want to be," Theodora said immediately, without hesitation, and the immediacy of it seemed to surprise him even though she had given him every possible indication of her feelings. "Then yes," he said. "I said yes," Theodora said. "I didn't ask yet properly," Edwin said. "Edwin, Theodora." He turned to face her fully. He took both her hands in his and the sun was on his face, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that she had come to think of as the realist version of him, the one that appeared when his considerable defenses relaxed. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I will try to deserve it." "You already do," Theodora said. "And yes, obviously yes." They were married in September of 1879, in the Harlow Creek church on a morning when the sky was the exact color of the painting on his wall. Her wall now, their wall, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were just beginning to turn gold. Celeste cried the right amount. Harold stood up in the front pew with his arms crossed and the expression of a man containing considerable emotion within a very small space. Beaumont Ferris, retired, sat in the back and slept through the sermon and woke in time for the vows. The school children, who were given the afternoon as a holiday, threw flower petals in the road outside. Theodora moved her things to the ranch in 3 wagon loads. The wooden box went in the first load. By the second load, Edwin had built her a small table in the bedroom's corner with good north-facing light, because he had read, in the one book about painting, he had quietly borrowed from the traveling bookseller who came through in August. That north-facing light was best for artists, and he had thought about this for 2 weeks before building the table. Theodora discovered the table on the afternoon she moved in, when she was putting the wooden box down and looking for somewhere to set it, and found it there already waiting, exactly the right height, with a shelf below for her supplies and a row of small iron hooks for her brushes. She stood in front of it and touched the wood, which was new and smooth and smelled of fresh work, and turned around and found Edwin standing in the doorway watching her with his hands in his pockets and the careful expression of a man waiting to know if he has gotten something right. "You built this for me," she said. "You need north light," he said. Theodora set the wooden box on the table and crossed the room and put her arms around Edwin Slater's neck and held on, and he put his arms around her and held on back. And outside the window the Kansas autumn was coming on with its gold and amber, and the sky was doing what it did, and the house that had been the color of dried clay and unadorned necessity was becoming, one thing at a time, something different. The first winter of their marriage was the one that hardened everything that was good between them and removed any remaining doubt. Kansas winters were not kind, and 1879 going into 1880 was worse than usual. A series of hard blizzards came down in January that lasted 3 days at a stretch and kept them confined to the ranch. The cattle had to be managed daily in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, and Edwin worked the pasture in weather that would have turned back a less determined man. And Theodora, who had not romanticized ranch life and was not about to start, worked beside him when the work permitted and ran the house with an efficiency that surprised Edwin, even though he had evidence by now that she was as capable as anyone he knew. They were also stripped of all the activity of ordinary life and left alone with each other in a house in the snow for 3 days at a stretch, genuinely excellent company for each other, which was not something either of them had taken for granted. Edwin read aloud in the evenings, something Theodora had initiated, and he had initially resisted, and then taken to with the enthusiasm of a man who discovers that something he has always loved privately is better shared. Theodora painted at her table in the corner, the small lamp casting warm light, and the paintings were winter ones now. The snow on the pasture, the ice on the creek, the particular violet gray of the sky before a storm. She did the walls in stages, not all at once and not with any plan she had articulated, but over the first year of their marriage, the house that had been bare slowly acquired color. The kitchen got curtains first, a deep burnt orange cotton she found at the dry goods store, because the kitchen was cold in the morning and the color helped. Then a small painting above the bedroom door, a miniature she'd done on a scrap of board, the rise behind the barn in summer. Then a rag rug in the front room, made with Celeste's help from scraps of wool, braided in the earth tones of the Kansas landscape, ochre and sienna, and the particular brown-green of the creek in summer. Edwin watched each addition without comment. He moved around the new items the way he moved around everything that entered his life practically, accommodating their existence without drama. But he also, slowly and then more noticeably, paid attention to them. He would stop in front of the miniature above the bedroom door and look at it for a moment before bed. He straightened the rag rug when it shifted out of place. Once, when Theodora took down the orange curtains to wash them and left the kitchen windows bare for a morning, he ate his breakfast in an absence that was different from his usual quiet, and when she put the curtains back up and the kitchen was orange again, he looked up from the accounts he was doing at the table and something in his face settled. She noticed. She did not say anything about it. She simply noticed and held it close. In the spring of 1880, Theodora became pregnant. She was not surprised exactly. They had not been trying to prevent it. But the news, when she was certain enough to speak it, arrived in her body with a quality of awe that she had not fully anticipated. She told Edwin on an April evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the night come over the plains, the sky going the way it did from amber to rose to the deep blue she had been painting since she arrived. Edwin was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, wonder, uncontained and unmanaged, moving across his features like the light moved across the grass when clouds passed overhead. "A child," he said. "Yes," Theodora said. He reached out and took her hand carefully, both hands around hers, and held it without speaking for a long time. The night came on and the stars appeared and the coyotes began their conversation somewhere to the north, and Edwin held his wife's hand on the porch of the house they had made together, and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The pregnancy was not easy in the way that pregnancies on the Kansas plains in 1880 were rarely easy. There was a doctor in Harlow Creek, a sensible man named Fletcher, who had seen enough of frontier medicine to be direct and practical, and who told them in June that things were going along normally, but that Theodora should rest when she was tired and eat enough and not try to manage the ranch, in addition to everything else she was managing. Theodora took half of this advice, the eating enough part, and continued teaching until August, and continued being herself in all the ways that defined her, which Edwin accepted because he understood by now that trying to make Theodora Leland into a less active version of herself was not a project that served anyone. He compensated by doing more himself quietly without making it a point. He got up before her in the mornings. He made sure the house was warm before she was out of bed. He hired a young man named Pete Dillard to help with the cattle for the summer, which cost money but which Edwin considered a necessary expense and therefore made without resentment. The baby came in November, a boy. Edwin was in the room with her, which was not the universal custom but which neither of them had considered doing differently. Dr. Fletcher was there. Celeste was there. The labor was long, and by the end of it Theodora was exhausted to her core, but the boy was healthy, large-lunged, and present in the world with a force of announcement that made everyone in the room feel they had witnessed something important. Edwin held his son for the first time with the same careful precision he applied to everything, but the expression on his face was nothing like precision. It was awe again, the same as the April evening on the porch, but larger now, sustained, the whole long wonder of it. "What shall we call him?" Theodora asked from the bed. She was worn through but luminous in the way of women who have just done something extraordinary. "You choose," Edwin said. He was still looking at the boy. "I want you to choose," Theodora said. Edwin looked up at her, then back at the boy. "James," he said. "James Leland Slater." Theodora smiled. He had taken her name into the child's, and she had not asked him to, and he had done it without ceremony, and it was the kind of thing Edwin Slater did that made Theodora love him in the particular way you love someone when they do exactly the right thing without knowing it was the right thing. "James," she said. "Yes." James Leland Slater turned out to be a child of considerable character, and not inconsiderable volume. He filled the house that had been quiet with the sounds of something growing, and Edwin, who had expected to love his son in the practical and purposeful way he had loved most things in his life, found instead that he loved James in a way that had no edges and no rational economy, that it was simply enormous and constant, and that it reordered everything around it. He built James a cradle from walnut wood, smooth and precisely jointed, and set it beside the bed where Theodora could reach it without rising. He carved the joints and planed the surfaces to a smoothness that was, for a practical man's practical object, genuinely beautiful, and when Theodora ran her hands over the wood and looked at him, he said it was a matter of structural integrity, and she said of course it is, and kissed him on the cheek. Theodora returned to teaching in February, bringing James to the schoolhouse with her for the first weeks, which the children received with enormous enthusiasm, and which proved to have a surprisingly positive effect on their reading comprehension, as several of them applied themselves with new vigor to books that promised to be read aloud to the baby. The school was growing. Harlow Creek was growing. The 1880s were bringing people to the plains, homesteaders, cattlemen, families from the eastern states and from Europe, drawn by the promise of land and the particular American belief that what you built with your hands was yours to keep. With the growth came new needs and new complications, and a community in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. Theodora was part of those decisions in ways that went beyond the schoolroom. She had become, without deliberately pursuing it, one of the people in Harlow Creek whose opinion was sought and whose word carried weight. She organized the first library collection for the school. She was a consistent voice on the school board for adequate funding and fair treatment of all students, which occasionally required her to push back against assumptions about which children's education was worth investing in. There were children in the school from families that some of the ranchers considered beneath consideration, the children of Mexican cattle hands, a family of black homesteaders named Yancey who had come from Missouri and settled 3 miles west of town, 2 half-Cheyenne children whose mother had married a white farmer and who were enrolled in the school in the face of considerable disapproval. Theodora taught all of them. She gave no indication that teaching them was anything other than her job, which was the most effective way she knew to communicate that it was not negotiable. Edwin, who heard what she was doing through the small channels of community gossip, went to the next school board meeting and voted with her on the question of the Yancey children's attendance, which removed one obstacle and created 2 new conversations that he handled by being Edwin Slater, which was to say a man whose position in the community was established and who was not going to debate himself. It was not a smooth process. The injustices of the territory were old and stubborn, and embedded in the assumptions of men who had built their sense of what was right on premises that didn't bear close examination. But the school, under Theodora, became incrementally more of what a school was supposed to be, and the children who attended it, all of them, grew up knowing that they had been worth teaching. James took his first steps in October of 1881, in the front room of the ranch house, from the edge of the braided rug to his father's outstretched hands, and Edwin caught him with a face so undone with joy that Theodora, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt the beauty of the moment as a physical thing. In 1882, she painted a new canvas for the front room wall, larger than the one above the fireplace. It was the ranch itself, the house, the barn, the fence lines, the pasture, with the summer sky above. But it was not a static image. She had caught the sense of motion in it, the grass moving, the light shifting, the quality of a life in progress. In the foreground, partly visible and not the subject of the painting but present in it, were 2 figures, a man and a woman standing on the rise behind the barn looking out. You could not see their faces. You did not need to. Edwin stood in front of it for a long time when she showed him. "That's us," he said. "Yes," Theodora said. "You put us in it. You are part of this land," Theodora said. "I am part of this land. It would be a dishonest painting without us." Edwin looked at the painting and then at his wife and then back at the painting. "You are very good," he said, which was not a statement about art. "So are you," Theodora said, and that was not a statement about ranching. The years that followed were the kind that build quietly. A good harvest and then another. James growing from a baby into a boy of considerable energy, and his father's dark eyes, and his mother's way of looking at the world as though it were worth looking at. In 1884 a second child came, a girl they named Clara Margaret, and the house that had been bare and practical for a single man's solitary purposes was now full in every possible sense, full of noise, of color, of the accumulated life of a family that had been, in its earliest form, a connection between two very different kinds of seeing, and had grown from that into something neither Edwin nor Theodora could have planned. Theodora kept painting. She never stopped. There was a period in 1883 when the demands of 2 children and a full school and a working ranch left her almost no time, and she felt the lack of it as a genuine deprivation, not self-pity but recognition. The painting was not a luxury. It was how she processed the world, how she found meaning in it, how she contributed something that mattered beyond the immediate and practical. Edwin, who had worked this out the previous winter by watching her in the evenings and noting the particular quality of her presence when she had and had not had time to paint, built her a proper studio in 1884. He built it off the back of the house, a small room with 2 north-facing windows and the good wide boards he ordered from the mill in Abilene, and he did not tell her what he was building until it was done, on the grounds that she would have told him not to and he had decided not to let her, which was an act of such clear-eyed love that, when she saw it, she sat on the floor of the new room and looked at the north light coming through the windows and cried for a few minutes, which she almost never did. "Edwin," she said, "you needed the space," he said. He was standing in the doorway with James on his hip and Clara in the crook of his other arm, because he had been managing both children while he showed her, and the image of him standing there holding both their children while she sat on the floor of the studio he had built her was, she thought, the most complete picture of who he was that she had ever seen. She painted it from memory that spring, when the light was right. It was one of the best things she ever did. The late 1880s brought Edwin Slater a level of material security he had worked toward for 15 years, and arrived at with the quiet satisfaction of a man for whom completion of a long project is its own reward. The ranch was profitable. The cattle were managed well, with Pete Dillard now a permanent hand and a second young man named George who had come up from Texas and proven reliable. The eastern fence line, which had been the presenting problem when Theodora first brought the Ladies' Aid to his door in that January of 1879, had been rebuilt 3 times now, and was as solid as anything he had ever built. He sat with Theodora on the porch on summer evenings and they watched James, who was 8 and then 9 and then 10, doing the small chores of a ranch boy, feeding the horses, helping with the fence checks, following Pete around the pasture with the solemn gravity of a child practicing at being a man. Clara followed 2 years behind her brother in everything, less solemn and more dangerous, a small force of nature who had her mother's eyes and her father's determination, and combined them in ways that made both her parents laugh and occasionally hold on to each other for support. Theodora had begun selling paintings. It had started almost by accident. A visitor to Harlow Creek, a man from Kansas City on his way to Denver, had seen one of her works displayed in the front window of the general store, which she'd loaned as a demonstration piece for the Ladies' Aid summer fundraiser, and had come to the school to find her and offered to buy it for more money than she had expected. She had sold it, and then sold another, and then had a letter from a gallery in Kansas City asking if she would send them work on consignment, which she did, and 3 of the 5 pieces sold within 2 months. Edwin was proud of this in the way he was proud of everything she did, which was completely and without qualification. He did not think of her success as incidental to his or secondary to the ranch. He thought of it as part of what they had made together, and he said so, once, on a winter evening, when she was worrying aloud about whether it was practical to continue sending paintings to Kansas City when the postage and the packing cut into the returns. He said, "You are going to keep sending them," with a finality that was not dismissive but supportive, the kind of certainty you offer someone when you believe in what they are doing more than they currently believe in it themselves. And Theodora had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Yes, I am," and gone back to packing the canvas. In the summer of 1888, Edwin was 41 and Theodora was 36, and James was 7 and Clara was 4. And the house on the Kansas plains was so completely itself: painted walls, braided rugs, the smell of oil paint and bread baking, and the leather and wool smell of a working ranch, that the bare clay-colored house of a decade before was impossible to imagine within it. Edwin walked through his rooms the way people walk through places they have grown into, without noticing the individual components, only the totality of what the place was. Except sometimes he noticed. Sometimes he stopped in front of the painting above the fireplace, the first one she had painted for him, the plains at sunset with the fence post and the water bucket and the coil of rope in the foreground, the ordinary made beautiful, and looked at it the way he had looked at it the first time, with the same quality of attention, the same awareness that something in the painting had understood something about him that he had not been able to understand about himself. He had only ever been practical and purposeful. Every nail he drove, every fence post he set, every acre he broke and planted had served an end. He had understood this as strength. He had not known before she came that it was also a kind of deprivation, that the practical man who removed everything unnecessary had also, without knowing it, removed the possibility of being surprised, of being moved, of being changed by something beautiful. She had not changed what he was. He was still practical. He was still purposeful. He still measured twice and cut once and never wasted a nail. But she had brought color into his house, and he had not taken it down. And in not taking it down, he had discovered that beauty was not opposed to function, that a painting of the plains was not a distraction from the plains but a way of seeing them truly, that the orange curtains in the kitchen were not frivolous but were the difference between a cold morning and a warm one, and the difference was not just visual but something that had no practical name and did not need one. He had not known before her that he was living in a house where he could not see the light because he had not yet put windows in. He knew it now. In the autumn of 1889, Kansas became the 34th state of the Union, which Harlow Creek celebrated with a bonfire and speeches and considerable quantities of pie, and Theodora painted the event from memory 3 weeks later, the long line of people along the main street, the bonfire light on their faces, the sky above the plains that had always been the same sky but was now, technically, a state sky. She sent the painting to the Kansas City Gallery, and it sold within a week to a man who had grown up on the plains and moved east for business and wanted something in his office that reminded him of what the air smelled like. She told Edwin this over breakfast the morning the letter arrived, and he read the letter himself and set it down and said, "That's good." 2 words, and the warmth in them was enormous, because she knew by now how to hear him. That winter James, now 9, began to show an interest in horses that went beyond the practical appreciation of a ranch boy. He wanted to understand them the way his mother wanted to understand light completely, precisely, with the goal of getting at the truth of the thing. He spent hours in the barn with Pete, who was patient and knowledgeable and saw the quality in the boy's attention, and by spring he was doing things with the horses that made Edwin stand at the barn door and watch with an expression of recognition. "He's got it," Pete said, coming to stand beside Edwin one April afternoon. "Yes," Edwin said. "Like you had it," Pete said, "except he's going to be better." Edwin watched his son working with the young gelding in the paddock, patient and precise and wholly absorbed, and felt the specific pride of a parent who sees something of themselves in their child that is better in the child than it ever was in themselves. "Maybe," Edwin said. He went and told Theodora, who was in the studio, and she put down her brush and came to the barn door and watched James for a while and then looked at Edwin and said, "He is completely himself, isn't he? But there are pieces of you in him that I can see and pieces of me, and I wonder sometimes how anyone survives the feeling of it." Edwin put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched their son, and the Kansas spring came in around them, loud with birds and warm with new sun. Clara's art revealed itself later, in a different medium entirely. She was 6 and then 7 and then 8, and the thing she was, it turned out, was a musician. Not the genteel parlor kind of musician, but the kind with a genuine and specific gift for hearing. She heard everything, the intervals between sounds, the patterns in noise, the way a song could be changed by slowing it down or shifting its starting point. This revealed itself dramatically one Sunday when the church's organ player was ill and couldn't attend, and Clara, who had been listening to that organ for 3 years and who had borrowed the church's hymn book and studied it with the same focused seriousness her father applied to everything, sat down at the organ and played 3 hymns from beginning to end without error. The congregation sat in a silence that was not indifference but awe. Theodora in the pew pressed both hands over her mouth. Edwin, beside her, looked at his daughter at the organ and then at his wife and said very quietly, without looking away from Clara, "We need to find her a proper teacher." They found her one the following year, a woman in Abilene who had studied music formally and who, upon hearing Clara play, agreed to teach her on a weekly basis. The arrangement required someone to drive Clara to Abilene and back every Saturday, which was a 20-mile round trip, and Edwin did it without complaint for 4 years. The years passed in the way of good years, not without trouble, because no years are without trouble, but with the quality of difficulty that is manageable because the thing at the center is solid. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the cattle market was difficult in 1893, and there was a period that year when money was genuinely tight, and the ranch required hard decisions, and Edwin made them methodically and without panic, and they came through it. There was a fire in the North Pasture in 1895 that took the old hay shed, and Edwin rebuilt it with James, now 15 and big enough to work, and the new shed was better than the old one. Theodora's painting had become, by the mid-1890s, something more than a private pursuit. She had a name in the regional art world, the kind of quiet name that belongs to artists whose work is genuinely good but who are not interested in being celebrated, only in being seen. She sold regularly to the Kansas City Gallery and twice to galleries in Chicago. A journalist from a Kansas City paper came to interview her in 1894, and she received him in the studio and talked about the plane's light, and the way painting a place meant you had to stop assuming you already knew it, and the journalist wrote something respectful and accurate, and the piece ran in the Sunday edition. Edwin read the piece at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in November with his coffee and James at his elbow trying to read over his shoulder and Clara playing scales in the front room, and when he finished, he set the paper down and looked out the window at his land and felt, at 47 years old, the full satisfaction of a life that had become vastly more than he had built it to be. He had built it to sustain him. It had done that. But sustaining and living were not the same thing, and he had been shown the difference by a woman who came off a stagecoach with a wooden box of paints and looked at his bare wall and said she would like to paint something for it. He looked at the painting above the fireplace, the planes at sunset, the rope, the bucket, the post, the evidence, plain and permanent, of the first thing she had given him. He would look at that painting for the rest of his life. He would look at it on ordinary mornings with his coffee, and on the evenings when he came in from the pasture tired, and on the nights when the weather was bad and they sat close to the fire, and it would always do what it had done the first time. Show him the truth of what was in front of him, rendered in color, offered without conditions. In 1897, James married a girl named Ruth Perkins, the daughter of a homesteader family from the next county, a sensible young woman of 20 who could ride better than most of the men in the territory, and who looked at James with the particular expression Theodora recognized because she had worn it herself. The wedding was at the Harlow Creek church and the reception at the ranch, long tables in the summer evening, and Edwin danced with Theodora for the first time since the Barker social 19 years before, in front of their son and his new wife and everyone they knew, and this time he did not step on her feet once. "You have been practicing," Theodora said. "In the barn," Edwin said. "Alone in the barn," Theodora said. "Pete watched once," Edwin said. "He had opinions." Theodora laughed and he held her closer and they danced under the Kansas stars, and Ruth Perkins, watching from the table, leaned to James and said, "Your parents are something," and James looked at his father dancing in the lantern light with his mother and said, "Yes, they are." The grandchildren began arriving in 1899. James and Ruth's first child was a boy they named Edwin Joseph Slater, which was a gift to the elder Edwin that he received with his usual economy of expression, and a warmth that was completely visible to anyone paying attention. He held the baby the way he had held James and the way he had held Clara, with the same enormous unreasonable love that he had discovered at 40 years old was not a practical emotion, but was, unquestionably, the most important one. Theodora was 54 when little Edwin was born, and she was not old in any sense that mattered. She painted the birth of every season that year with a clarity and presence that were the work of someone entirely inhabiting their life. She was also beginning to collect students. 3 young women in Harlow Creek had started coming to the studio on Saturday afternoons for informal painting lessons, and the teaching fed the same thing in Theodora that teaching children had always fed: the pleasure of watching someone discover what they were capable of. In 1901, Clara, now 17, was accepted to study music formally at a conservatory in Chicago. It was a significant thing, rare and expensive, and the question of how to manage it was discussed at length at the kitchen table in the autumn of 1900. It would cost money they had. It would take Clara far away, which was harder to calculate. It would give her what she needed, which was the only number that mattered. Edwin sat at that table and looked at his daughter and said, "You are going." Clara looked at her father with her mother's eyes. "It's an awful lot of money," she said. "Yes," Edwin said. "You are going anyway." Clara crossed the table and hugged her father with both arms, which she had been doing since she was old enough to reach him, and Edwin held his daughter and looked at Theodora over Clara's shoulder, and Theodora looked back at him with the expression she had been wearing since that July afternoon outside the school 22 years before, the one that said he was a good man, and which he had never fully gotten used to receiving, and which he hoped he never would. Clara went to Chicago in the autumn of 1901. She wrote every week. By 1903, she was playing in a small ensemble and had a teacher who told her parents in a letter that their daughter was genuinely gifted, and that they had done the right thing in sending her, and that they should be proud, which was information Edwin folded and put in his chest pocket and took out several more times that week. James and Ruth had a second child in 1902, a girl they named Theodora, called Teddy, and a third in 1904, another boy named Marcus. The ranch that Edwin had built for one person and then shared with one other person and then raised 2 children in was now the center of something larger. A family that spread across the county and gathered at the kitchen table and on the porch and in the fields at harvest time and made the kind of noise that a house built for silence either resents or becomes worthy of. This house had become worthy of it long ago. On a warm evening in September of 1905, Edwin Slater and Theodora Leland Slater sat on the porch of the house they had lived in together for 26 years. The house had the orange curtains and the braided rugs and the paintings on every wall, and the studio off the back with its north-facing windows, and the cradle in the bedroom that had held James and Clara and now held visiting grandchildren. Edwin was 58 and Theodora was 53, and they were the ages of people who have arrived somewhere and know it. The plains stretched out before them in the late September light, gold and amber, and the long horizontal purple of the shadows, which was exactly what she had painted on his wall the first spring of their marriage, and which was also, every evening, the real and living thing. James and Ruth were in the field to the north, doing the last of the fall work with Pete and George. The grandchildren were asleep inside, Teddy and little Edwin and baby Marcus all in the back bedroom, overseen by Ruth's mother who had come to help for the week. Clara's last letter was on the kitchen table, describing a concert she had played in 2 weeks before, and it was a letter full of music. Edwin had his coffee. Theodora had her tea. She was barefoot, which she had been in the evening since approximately the first summer of their marriage, and which he had never once objected to because he had learned very quickly that the question of Theodora's shoes in the evenings was not his question to have opinions about. "We should add a room," Edwin said. Theodora looked at him. "What room?" "James and Ruth will want their own house soon," Edwin said. "But we'll have family here more often with the grandchildren. We could add a room off the east side." "For guests?" Theodora looked out at the plains. "A room with windows," she said. "Obviously with windows," Edwin said. "Big ones," Theodora said. "Facing east so the morning light comes in." "Big east-facing windows," Edwin said. "And I want to paint the door," Theodora said. "The front door, I've been thinking about it, a deep green, the color of the creek in summer." Edwin looked at the front door, which was the natural wood it had always been, unpainted, purely functional. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at his wife. "Green," he said. "A deep particular green," Theodora said. "I know exactly the shade." Edwin looked back at the door. He looked at the plains. He set down his coffee cup and stood up and walked to the front door and stood in front of it, considering, the way he considered every modification to his property, structurally, practically, in terms of what it cost and what it gained. Then he turned around and looked at Theodora on the porch with her tea and her bare feet and her eyes that were the same as they had been when she looked up at him from the floor of the general store over a scattered tin of nails, and he said, "Paint it whatever color you want." Theodora smiled. It was the full smile, the one that used her whole face. "I already knew you were going to say that," she said. "Did you?" Edwin said. "You haven't taken anything down yet," Theodora said. "In 26 years." Edwin looked at her for a long moment with the expression that had no practical category and no economic purpose, the expression that had arrived in him on the day he stood in his kitchen watching her paint his wall and had not left since. He walked back to the porch and sat beside her and picked up his coffee and looked at the plains going gold in the September light. "No," he said. "I haven't." They sat there until the light was gone, in the comfortable silence of two people who have spent long enough together that the quiet between them has texture and warmth. And the Kansas night came on with its stars and its coyotes and its wind moving through the grass. And inside the house the grandchildren slept, and the paintings were on the walls, and the orange curtains were in the kitchen, and the braided rug was on the floor, and the wooden box was on the table in the studio with the north-facing windows. And the front door was going to be painted a deep particular green that was exactly the color of the creek in summer. And Edwin Slater, who had only ever been practical and purposeful, who had built every inch of his life with a measuring eye and an unsentimental hand, sat on his porch with his wife in the September dark and felt the full weight of a life that was more than he had built it to be, and knew, with the same certainty with which he knew weather and wire and the quality of soil, that the best thing he had ever done was not take it down. Not a single piece of it. Not one nail. Not one stroke of paint. Not one moment of the color she had carried into his house, from the very first step she took through the door. James came in from the field an hour later and found his parents still on the porch in the dark, not talking, just there. And he stood at the corner of the house for a moment before they knew he was there, watching them the way you watch something that is teaching you about what to hope for. And then he said good night and went inside and got his wife, and held her in the dark of their room, and thought about east-facing windows and the color of deep green and the particular sound of a house that has been filled completely and without reservation with a life worth living. The new room went up that October, Edwin and James and Pete working together in the crisp fall air while Ruth and Theodora planned the windows, which were large and east-facing exactly as agreed. And when the room was done, it had a braided rug that Theodora and Ruth made together from the good wool scraps, and a small painting on the wall above the bed, another miniature. This one of the porch at dusk with two figures sitting in the chairs, barely visible in the paint, easily mistaken for shadow. And the front door, when Theodora painted it in November before the cold came in for good, was the deep particular green of the creek in summer. And it was the first thing you saw when you came up the road to the house, before you saw the curtains or the rugs or the paintings, before you knew anything about the life inside, just the green door and the gray November light, standing open, the way it always was. The way it had been since the first morning Theodora crossed the threshold and decided that this was where she wanted to be. Edwin looked at the door when the paint was dry and she was standing beside him, and he looked at her and he said, "Good." And she knew, because she had always known how to hear him, that what he meant was, "Yes, and thank you, and here we are, and I would do every bit of it again." And so, in the end, that was the whole of it. Not an absence of practicality and purpose. Those things had built the house and the fence lines and the life that held everything together. But the practicality and the purpose had been given at last, a color worth seeing, and the man who had hung the painting had been wise enough, in whatever deep and inarticulate way he operated, not to take it down. He kept it all. He kept everything. And the house on the Kansas plains held it, all of it, in the way that good houses hold the lives inside them, completely, permanently, without any reservation at all.